G'day everybody, my name's Dr. Leon Levin, and what I want to do is have a conversation with you today about the nature of the online teaching space. All of us have been confronted with COVID, and the reality of online teaching now is very much embedded within how universities operate. And I felt, based on my experience, that we explore those considerations and those thoughts. But before we start the journey, I should at least introduce myself. I've got a strong academic background from a doctorate down, but that doesn't make me anything special. It just means I'm persistent. I've also worked in a number of different fields. I've worked at Price Waterhouse. I used to be a film producer, writer-producer. I was the marketing manager of a television station. I've also been involved with politics, been involved in raising capital, lived in the United States where I pitched various venture capital ideas. I've worked in the political space. And I've also been involved, I am involved currently with a US organization involved in training first responders. In the last 12 years, I've worked at 8 universities on 2 continents. And it's really given me an insight into the challenges and dynamisms that take place in the teaching space. Because I largely see myself as a student, not necessarily as a facilitator or teacher. I learn more from the students than they'll ever learn from me. But what it has shown me is that the challenges that students have, the challenges that institutions have, are fundamental, especially in the nature of how we can effectively communicate to the cohort that is now coming up. In this conversation, I want to look at about 10 areas of discussion. The first one is the nature of universities, their mission. Looking at the role of the facilitator, how plans are constructed, the nature of the camera and how we should talk through it, not to it, the art of culture, and how listening manifests itself in that. The discussion of how we teach, the pedagogies. Do we teach content or do we teach themes? Linked to that, the nature of assessment. Also appreciating the challenges that people have in today's world, ensuring that every facilitator and every human being maintains a sense of empathy. Ultimately, we look at the global reach as well. I'm hoping there's people from outside Australia that are looking at this. And finally, the nature of pushback and the intrinsic identity issues that traditional ways of looking at things can actually inhibit the process. But why listen to me? Well, I guess it's your call, but I'd prefer to listen to people that actually are going through that activity itself. I have 2 sons, Aaron, who's in a university, and my younger son, Gideon, very much involved in the TAFE sector. I'd like to ask them and introduce them to you first and foremost on the challenges they have. They're not actors, they might fluff their lines, be patient with them. Aaron, Gideon, would you kindly introduce yourself to the audience?
So my name's Aaron. I'm currently studying a Bachelor's of Business Marketing and Management at La Trobe Bandura. I'm currently in my 3rd year and I've done 2 years of online teaching.
Gid?
Hi, I'm Gideon. I've completed my Cert 2 in Engineering, Mechanical and Fabrication in Moorabbin, Holmes Glen.
And I'm very proud of both of them. The question I'm going to ask both of you, and I'll defer to you, Aaron. I mean, you've studied in the face-to-face case and you've morphed into the online space. What are the basic differences that you've observed?
Well, for one, the most obvious one would be the social interaction. But I'd also say the online space doesn't really create an engaging environment. It doesn't inspire creativity. It's lacking in a lot of potential where I think it could be improved.
Okay, well, it'll be interesting to explore that, and that's the purpose of today. What about your experiences, Gid? Especially if it's a different tertiary stream.
Yes. With how it interacted with me, it wasn't really much of a class. It was more of a 10-minute check-up kind of thing every so often. When we were meant to go in, they would give us a call, and they see if we needed anything, but it was really unengaging.
Was it fulfilling?
No.
Aaron, was the learning experience fulfilling? Did you get something out of it?
I wouldn't say I got the full value of the course. It did. Like I said, there's a lot that can be improved. It wasn't fulfilling. The lecturers typically did not go that extra mile to make the course very engaging and...
Did you feel isolated?
Yeah, in a lot of ways I did.
And the learning experience, do you think you got most out of it? Do you think what you're learning now can be applied to your future career?
Absolutely.
So it's really important for that information to be communicated in an effective way.
Yes.
Would you agree with that, Gideon?
Yes, definitely.
If you had to choose, obviously online and face-to-face, I assume you'd go face-to-face
Well, there's a lot of positives to teaching online, but I prefer face-to-face.
because it's more engaging, less isolation, and you feel you're part of the equation.
Yeah, absolutely.
Would that be fair for you?
Yeah, 100%.
Well, look, it's an interesting observation they've made. The fundamental issue they're talking about is how can we become more part of the narrative? How can we become more enmeshed within the process of education, learning, and exchange of thoughts? This is what we're going to look at today. And as I said, I want to thank you for the time you're giving me, and I hope that this is of some value. The thing I want to talk about first and foremost is what is the mission of the university? In other words, what's its core strategic intent? Once we establish that, we can then move forward to the other areas we've discussed. I'm looking forward to going this journey, so let's get started. I think the starting point is to define what the core strategic intention of a university is. I'll ask you, people out there listening, specifically students, why do you go to university? I would argue most of you might say to get a degree, get a job. Was that or the army? I don't know. But the bottom line is this. My view, university is about building bridges. No, it's not about an engineering subject. Building bridges, it's a metaphor from going from one stage of your life to the next stage of your life. It's creating that pathway that will enable you to achieve the milestones and the aspirations that you want. It's not purely about the transactional nature of knowledge gathering. It's about critical thinking. It's about the capacity to establish relationships. It's understanding the holistic narrative that university can bring to the table. Unless universities understand and embrace that, organically and emotionally, the challenge that we will have in the online space is as those constructs to some degree will be lost. We can't replicate them in terms of face-to-face, but by acknowledging them and being aware of the mission, we can become agile in our thinking and develop ways and means by which those variables can actually put in place. So I leave you with this thought before we move on to the next dynamic, actually the art of the facilitator. For me, universities are about bridge building, enabling people to get close-ups of the horizon, to define their futures, and to understand the pathways that they need to be able to create by themselves and with groups to enable those futures to become a reality. Well, now we've looked at the nature of the strategic mission of the university. The question is, how is that mission manifest? In other words, who is the tip of the spear? The tip of the spear are the very people that engage with the students in the first place. You call them lecturers, facilitators, whatever. I personally think the term's anachronistic. The challenge I have is when people call people students or lecturers. What we've actually established is a bias structure, which can create an issue in relation to how people connect. I guess where I'm coming from is this. A really good facilitator, a really good educator, in my view, especially in the world of online teaching, is one that can relate to the very people he's talking to or she's talking to. Notice, I haven't used the word student. In my view, a facilitator, especially in the online space, must be someone who has had enormous experiences, an eclectic worldview, the capacity to relate diverse ideas, and someone who's comfortable with dealing with human beings. Not necessarily see them as functionaries that need to have information imparted to them. Building that relationship, building that commitment, building that human connection is a fundamental variable that needs to be considered when looking at the type of facilitator or communicator or educator, irrespective of the institution. I would argue the best people we should look at are some of the Tonight Show hosts, Seth Meyers and others, who, especially in lockdown, were brilliant in connecting with people. It doesn't mean the traditional academic is not the right person. Many of them are brilliant. The challenge is the pathways and the emphasis that universities historically have focused on academic papers and academic excellence. It's not that they're mutually exclusive to the capacity of building relationships, but they don't necessarily emphasize that in the career pathways that these individuals can achieve. The other thing, it's really important in my view, to have a diverse background, to have a range of looking at ideas based on experiences, successes and failures that can make subjects come alive. Facilitators must show their personality, must not be afraid to be wrong, must not be afraid to show their vulnerabilities, and most of all, must remain human. Take away those old robes from the 14th and 15th century that determine whether or not you're a doctorate, a master's, or a bachelor's. I've got more degrees than a thermometer, but to be honest with you, doesn't matter when I'm dealing with students. Being able to show your commitment and your love and your passion for the people rather than the subject, especially when we're talking through the camera, I said through the camera, is a really important variable in determining the right type of communicator or educator. This is something that must really be absorbed within institutions, especially in the online space, because by its very nature it's detached. Being able to get that personality across, that passion, that personality, that experience, that vulnerability are some of the key elements that will make a good educator really effective in connecting with individuals. We've looked at the nature of the educator. Now let's look at the nature of planning. A facilitator can only do so much, but the act of being an educator does not start when the class starts. It really starts, ideally, significantly before the first lesson. It might sound self-evident. Sun Tzu stated that every battle is won before it is fought. What does that mean? It means you need to plan. It means you need to plan in the context of the online narrative that you're dealing with. It means that you need to understand the variables and the challenges and the problems that students will face and come up with scenarios to be able to deal with those issues and problems. It requires a whole lot of thinking before you can become spontaneous. Winston Churchill was once asked how he was able to create so many witticisms, and he said it takes him an hour to come up with one. And that's what planning can offer you. It can give you the capacity to be agile. It can give you the capacity to understand what is needed. But in the planning process, it's really a manifestation of what one would call design thinking. Engaging with the student, engaging with the audience, and understanding what are the key issues that they're going to be confronted with, and plan accordingly. I know from personal experience, when I've used Zoom, I have actually used breakout rooms in the past rarely. The feedback I got from the students were, the breakout rooms are great, Leon, but they were too short. They were only 2 minutes. It didn't give us time to develop. I listened to them. I understood what they had to say. Guess what? When I do use breakout rooms, and I don't use them that often, I make sure they're at least 4 to 5 minutes and ensure that the structures within those rooms are understood. I also make sure that the structures upon which I build each teaching period is also understood by the student. People appreciate what the objectives are, what their approach is, and what the narrative is going to be about. But the other thing I do, and it's important for everyone to consider, a plan is not set in stone. It is not something from Mount Sinai with the 10 Commandments, thou shalt not. It really is a guidepost. It really is a means by which you will be able to reference what you're doing. Robert McNamara talked about the fog and friction of war. The fog of war are things that you do not know in the planning process. The friction of war is things that you do know in the planning process will never run smoothly. So what does that mean? How does it relate to planning? Make sure you do plan. But most importantly, make sure you remain agile. You are rooted and grounded in what you need to achieve. But it is a servant, not a master. What you need to achieve is self-evident. The plan will enable you to have a myriad of pathways to get there. And a really effective educator, communicator, whomever or however you want to define it, will never forget your strategic mission and goal. But you'll always remember that there's many ways to be able to achieve that. And a good plan and a good planner will appreciate that. We've looked at planning. Now I think it's really important we understand the medium in which those planes are going to manifest themselves, and that's the role of the camera. Yeah, don't be shocked. I'm still the same person, but I'm using the camera. I'm using the camera in the online space. Isn't this exciting? How many times have you been in a meeting where this is all you can see? And if they bend the right way, you can see up their nose. Really, really interesting, isn't it? Do you feel comfortable? The truth of the matter is, when we talk to people, when we engage with people, we're not in their face. We're not so close that we can smell what they had for lunch. Why do people do that currently? Why do people position a camera so you're perceived as looking down upon them? Why do people position a camera so all you can see is the body and you can't see the personality of the individual? We are all television stars, we're all movie stars, we're all YouTube stars. Educators must know that. And I'll tell you another thing, guys and girls. The simple truth of the matter is this. The very audience that we're targeting is really comfortable in this space. And unless we start to appreciate the nature of the camera and how we frame a set, we will lose them. We will lose our personality, and to a very real extent, we will become this ogre, this Mothra, this Godzilla that is looking down at them as opposed to engaging with them. Have a look at how I framed this shot. While we were shooting this, we were very much aware of the nature of the framing of the shot. Behind, you can see photos of my family, of experiences. You can see the books. You can also see, I guess, in shot Nostradamus, my little friend over here. All of a sudden, you're starting to have an understanding of who I am as a human being. I'm looking through you. I'm looking through the lens. I'm looking really, hopefully, through your soul, through the lens of a camera. And please, don't tell me we can't do it. How many of you go to a movie when you can, post-COVID, and get involved with a character, as opposed to realizing it's purely celluloid on a screen? I believe that we need to be able to understand the incredible benefits the camera brings. What you can see now is the way I've set up my camera. What you can see now is that you don't need to see be a Steven Spielberg or Cecil B. DeMille. I've got a small office. And what I've been able to do is simply set up a camera so we're able to see the broader Leon Levin. So the books are there, and many times I've got people who are in the class and, what book is that? What book is that? And I'm also able to call upon a book if I need to and just bring it into conversation. My office is small. It's not set up for a environment of basically a television studio. But it doesn't take much to do it. And don't give me the excuse that the camera is embedded in the computer. You can get an inexpensive camera for a couple of $100. If it comes down to it, and the purpose of being able to educate, and the purpose of being able to engage with, is being able to communicate in a form people feel comfortable with, I'm sure you wouldn't necessarily go into a face-to-face classroom with your bathers on. Maybe it's hot, maybe you're in Bondi near the beach. But really, people expect a certain dynamic. And it is beholden on the educator to be able to appreciate that and to create the environment that will lead to that process. And I'll tell you another reason why it's really important to set the camera up, the lighting up, the framing up. It facilitates a culture. It facilitates a dynamic where people want to be part of the process and will emulate what you do. The best people to look at, and I stated previously in the discussion, have a look at the Tonight Show hosts, especially during lockdown, and how they frame their shot. That's what you should do. That's what all educators should do. And it's also what universities and corporations should understand as critical. First impressions, you only get one chance. And as soon as that camera's on, that's the impression you're going to get. I mentioned culture and how the camera can facilitate that. That's the next thing we're going to look at the moment. Leading off from what we've looked at in terms of how we actually frame the shot, I think it's really important to understand the nature of the culture you want to create within the online environment, and in fact within any environment. I often ask the students that I deal with, what is my strategy in the classroom? They often say past knowledge, critical thinking, I use humor a lot, crack jokes. They talk about a whole lot of different things. Very few of them actually get it. I'll tell you what my strategic intention within a classroom is to make people feel comfortable, to make people feel safe. By making people feel safe or enabling them to feel that they're not going to be judged, the art of conversation does not die. The capacity of having alternate points of view is encouraged. Political correctness is left by the door. The ability for people to express their thoughts, genuine thoughts, are able to be nurtured. And isn't that what university should be about? Let me rephrase that. Isn't that what life should be about? No one is judged in the discussions that I have. And believe me, they can be controversial. In fact, I want them to be controversial. If everybody agrees with everybody else, then the vast majority of the group is unneeded. But how do you do that? Well, I guess it really comes down to building that relationship, to be able to engage with people, to learn to listen. How do you listen? It's not just with your ears. It's by asking the questions that need to be asked. It's by engaging in conversation and actually wanting to be passionately committed, emotionally involved with the very things people are saying. How many times have you been in a conversation where, quite frankly, you can't wait for someone to shut up so you can tell them how good you are? It happens all the time. We all do it. But in the online space, more so than most, simply because people are isolated, we as human beings must learn to truly listen and to truly be interested in what people say. And in the next section, when we look at pedagogy and themes, you'll understand where this is going. It means that allow people to be divergent, allow people to go on tangents, encourage it. Never forget to bring it back to the core discussion. But listening to what people are about, not just in what they're saying, but what they're really meaning, is a really important skill set we must all learn, not just in the online space, but in our day-to-day living. It is really more so, though, in the online environment, which is what we're talking about today, because these people feel isolated as a general statement. The act of not being in a classroom, the act of being in a small caged box while we're trying to manage COVID, is something that people have to deal with, especially younger people who should be out there making mistakes. All of a sudden they're confined in an environment where they're forced to deal with individuals who, by their own very nature, are struggling with isolation, by their own very nature, are struggling in the dynamic of trying to teach in the online model. These are important awareness factors that we must have as educators. And in listening to people, reading their body language, which is why the camera is so important. If you can construct that camera environment, so will they. So will they. You'll be able to understand what they're saying. You'll more importantly be able to understand what they're not saying. It's not about trying to tick a box. It's not about trying to fill out a timesheet. It's about truly being immersed in the conversation. And it starts with a very simple construct. Build a culture of trust, build a culture of safety, and build a culture of transparency. Easy words. Paradoxically, not difficult to do. All of us do it with our friends. All of us. Why can't we translate that in the online space? I don't know. You tell me. What we're going to look at next is the nature of the pedagogy, the themes, and the content, and how that can lead to creating that culture of safety. Well, the conversation we had before about culture and listening is a really important thing to consider. But the question is, we still need to get across the information. We still need to get across the content. How do we do that in the online model? Well, I do know the face-to-face model, it's much more interactive, simply because you're dealing with people. I have a way of dealing with this, and I want to share it with you. I don't teach content. Don't tell the universities I work with. What I try and do is develop themes, understand what that content is about. and be able to communicate that through the online model from a thematic point of view. Now, why is that important? I think one of the core reasons of being able to express themes is that it does facilitate the nature of critical thinking. It's not about ticking a box. It's not about saying, I've learnt this fact, let's move on. It's about understanding an environment that facilitates discussion and debate. And that's a really important consideration when dealing in online discussions, because you need to facilitate that conversation. If we're talking about facts and boxes to tick, well, yes, we can talk about it. But if we're talking about themes upon which those facts are founded on and predicated on, the conversation becomes much more dynamic. It doesn't mean you're not communicating information. Socrates said, I cannot teach you anything. The best I can do is make you think. And that's what I try and achieve within the online narrative. Appreciating what the core themes are. And again, this goes back to what we talked about with planning. Understanding what the subject stands for. And being able to deconstruct those threads, understand those variables, and put them together in a narrative that is not only really effective, but can facilitate the nature of storytelling. Storytelling is incredibly important. It is as old as the hills. Adam and Eve probably sat around when Foxtel wasn't working, telling stories to each other. Storytelling is a powerful tool, and it can be adapted in almost any discipline. If we're involved in purely teaching facts, ticking boxes, and making sure that they understand the historical reality, without understanding what those boxes and those historical realities stand for, and how they relate to themselves in a modern world, then, with all due respect, get on Google. It's a very easy way of finding information. Universities, at least at the tertiary level as I see it, must facilitate the discussion of thematic debate. Yes, it is embedded with core information. Otherwise, the themes themselves are vacuous. But by doing that, you're able to develop a culture of conversation. You're able to develop a culture of critical thinking. You're able to develop a culture of people inventing new ways of perspective, as opposed to a whole lot of people who can tick a box. Never more so important than in an online environment where people are in boxes and they want to be able to explore their own identities and their sense of self. How do we do that? Each person must follow their own drum. But the next question is, how do we assess it? And that's what we're going to look at next. Look, it's all well and good to talk about a really interesting pedagogy and really interesting development of themes, but at the end of the day, a university and any institution must be able to assess the information that has been communicated. The challenge, I think, in the online space is to develop pieces of assessment that are actually creative, innovative, and in line with that model. Now, it doesn't mean necessarily always doing a Harvard case study review, although they have their place. But I firmly believe that the nature of assessment should embrace and embody the very medium in which we're using. The idea of using the camera, the idea of using group conversation, even though they're isolated within their own little homes because they can't be in a classroom, must be embraced and must be looked at. Surely that the creative juices that exist within the educators can manifest themselves in more innovative and creative ways of pieces of assessment. Let's look at how you might view this conversation we're having online. Whether you contact me, whether you leave comments, whether you facilitate discussion, are all ways of assessing the effectiveness of what we're talking about now. The question is, do we follow old models or do we challenge ourselves? Do we develop ways that can be sequential? Do we develop models that can be really innovative in the context of the new world we're living in? Don't underestimate the capacity of one's old imagination. It's a question of repositioning the way we see things, reframing the debate. That's what we need to do. Assessments must not only assess the content and thematic discussion that is had within the environment in which we operate. Assessment must also assess the critical thought and critical innovation and creativity that must manifest itself in this new world. All too often I've heard people who are communicating saying, well, this is the way it's been done, therefore we must do it again. Well, we don't forget history. We don't forget where we came from. But it doesn't necessarily mean that's the way we should always act. Otherwise, we'd still be in the horse and buggy days. It's also important to appreciate the world that we're dealing with and the people we're dealing with in the COVID-induced psychosis of anxiety, isolation. We need to be empathetic. And empathy is what we're going to be looking at next. Well, the previous discussion, we've really looked at the nature of universities and the variables embedded within them themselves. But there's one thing we also need to consider, and that's the people who are engaging with, the students. The capacity to develop an empathetic environment. And that's really important, largely because of the world we're facing. My sister, Helen Levin, is a trained counsellor. She deals with a whole lot of challenges involved in people's self-esteem, their sense of isolation and so forth. I thought it would be worthwhile to have a very quick chat with her to get an understanding of what people are going through and why it's important for universities and facilitators to be aware of that. Helen, look, thanks for your time. I really appreciate it. In your experience as a counsellor, what have you noticed over the last 2 years as a result of COVID? What are the impacts that it's having on the psyche of individuals, and especially young people?
Well, my students, which are, university students aged between 17 and 25, are finding it really difficult to get motivated, really difficult to actually, they can sit down and start assignments, but they can't get into them. It's it's everything. It's a social, there's no social interaction. So they're missing out on seeing friends. They're missing out on, just normal, for want of a better word, activities that they were doing before lockdown.
Do you find that can lead to issues of depression or issues of isolation or feeling
Absolutely.
that they're lack of self-worth?
Well, they're presenting with anxiety. They're presenting with depression. And basically the main theme that I'm getting is that they're unmotivated, they've lost self-esteem, they don't even feel like they are accomplishing anything or achieving anything, or it's really detrimental on their meaning, their purpose. So yeah, they all sign up, they all pay for their, university degrees, they're all really passionate about what they do. And then they're on a Zoom, with classes. Half of the monitors are off. The lecturers don't know how to communicate. One word that comes back from students is disgust. I'm disgusted in my lecturers that I used to really have a great relationship with when we were face to face, and now I'm looking at what they're doing in Zooms and they're not engaging me. I'm bored. I'm not learning anything that is going to nurture and develop my passion for what I'm studying for.
Do you think that lack of engagement and the extrapolation of isolation within the classroom exacerbates the challenges that they have?
Absolutely. They can't talk to each other. They can't. Imagine you're sitting in a class and you're doing face-to-face and you've got a round table and you're sitting there and conversing and having a dialogue and getting feedback from each other. It doesn't just make you more inclined to increase your motivation and ambition. It also it creates self-awareness. It creates self-esteem.
Well, what do you think potentially some of the long-term effects could be as a result of this dislocation?
Well, if they don't, they call it languishing. There's what the new buzzword is, that the clients are actually experiencing. And they say languishing is between living your best life and living in hell. And what's happening is if you don't get to these students before the actual anxiety and depression symptoms set in and become behavioural, they can lead to depressive symptoms that, can affect them physically. They can get sick physically and they can get sick mentally.
Well, I think what you've raised, Helen, and I want to thank you for your time, is some really important issues. And I think what you're really talking about is, from a facilitator and university's point of view, it's more than just the act of education transfer and knowledge transfer. We've got to be aware of the realities that people are dealing with. And if we're not aware of those realities, our capacity to really affect and impact upon them is going to be significantly reduced. And not only that, our capacity to be able to communicate information and transfer knowledge and development of critical thinking to a very large extent is going to be castrated. Helen, again, thank you for your time. I really appreciate it. Because what we're going to look at now is the nature of the global world that we're going to be engaged with and the opportunities that the online teaching can offer in that multicultural melting pot. I'm really grateful for my sister to explore a little bit of the challenges that everybody's facing. It's not unique to Australia or to Europe or to Asia. Being isolated, being in our little cocoons has a direct impact on mental health. And I think educators must realise that. But there's also another advantage of the online model. Guess what? You can talk to anybody, anywhere, anyhow, anytime. And that's damn good. I'm hoping there's people from all over the world that are looking at this. So it means, from a cultural point of view, from a multicultural melting pot, which e-learning can offer, it's an incredible opportunity to look at diverse experiences, to look at diverse cultures, and to be able to enmesh that in the world that is so interconnected. It's a really important opportunity to be able to deal with people from all over the world. I held a class of over 150 Indian students, where we talked about, of all things, Sir Donald Bradman and the Australian cricket team. I had a very close friend who was a confidant of Bradman, Roland Perry, who wrote his biography. How amazing was that, to engage with so many different ideas and thoughts in India, a half a world away from Australia. I've had students from New York, I've had students from Mexico, I've had students from India, I've had students from Pakistan. Guess what? All in the same room, but in their own countries. This is what it can offer. This is the world that the online teaching model can develop. And it adds such a kaleidoscope of ideas and thoughts. And it is a means by which we build bridges. Remember, we talked about bridges in the beginning? Between societies, between cultures, between individuals. It must be embraced. That culture must manifest itself. We learn more from difference than we do from similarity. And this is something that the online space really can offer. And it's something that must be exploited, developed, and nurtured to the benefit not only of the institutions, not only to the globe, but to the individuals themselves. Don't underestimate the importance of engagement. The last thing I want to look at is pushback. In a very real sense, it is the hurdles we must overcome. Well, so far we've looked at really a really positive way of looking at things, understanding what can be done and how we can do it. We've looked at the nature of pedagogies. We've looked at the idea of a global environment. We've looked at issues of assessment, planning, and the actual educator. But you know what? Unless we understand the world in which universities and other institutions function, then initiatives by their very nature might never manifest themselves. That's not to say universities don't care, they do. They're incredible institutions that have facilitated some of the greatest minds, obviously the greatest minds of the millennia. And the people that work within universities are fundamentally committed overall, as a general rule of thumb, to the betterment of the institutions themselves and the simple reality that they want to do good. But there are some inherent biases, both conscious and unconscious, that manifest themselves. Traditional universities have invested enormous amounts of money in plant and equipment. When I say plant and equipment, I'm talking about buildings, lecture theatres and so forth. That's a sunk cost which is very significant. The nature upon which progress takes place in many of the universities can also be predicated on academic papers and so forth. Again, a critical variable in the context of that. But there has to be a reframing within the university model to be able to accept that now what we're looking at is really a fundamental issue of building relationships with students. It's more than ticking a box. In the online space especially, because we don't have that human contact, we must be able to develop processes within institutions to enable us to nurture that personality, to nurture that creativity, as opposed to talk about it. The challenge is the traditional ways that have got people to positions of authority are the traditional ways that have got people to authority. It takes brave administrators and brave educators to be willing to challenge some of the fundamental elements that enable them to get to the top in the first place. We have got to constantly reinvent our own futures, as Henry Ford said. The most important history is the history we create today. And that can only be built upon the willingness for institutions that are seeped in history, seeped in tradition, seeped in a sense of identity of where they came from, to also adopt, adapt, and fundamentally accept the need to be agile, to need to be able to deal with new worlds. It doesn't mean you forget where you came from. So Isaac Newton, when asked why he was so smart, he said he wasn't. He stood on the shoulders of giants. Institutions must never forget their history, must never forget what they stand for, must never forget their legacy. But we've come a long way from the quill and the pen. We really must evolve to the next stage. We really must challenge assumptions, however painful that might be. Because if the foundation stone of universities is one thing, it should be to challenge assumptions. And it's based upon that narrative, and it's based upon that model that we can move forward in a world that's expanding intellectually, emotionally, culturally, at an exponential rate. No longer do we tiptoe and walk slowly. We run, and we run quickly, but we must be aware of where we're running and understand the reasons we're doing it. Look, I want to thank you for your time and your patience in listening to what I had to say. In the background, what you're looking at is a piece of assessment that a group of my students did in a subject called Innovation, Creativity and Design. I'm so proud of what they did. It means more to me than any degree or any doctorate. These students were not film students, they were management students. And they created what you're looking at in less than 6 weeks. Why? Not because they were Steven Spielbergs. Most of them, if not all of them, didn't understand stop motion from the beginning. But what they actually were committed to what they were doing. Their assessment, their subject, there was an identity consideration there. Part of their education was part of their dynamic. They got more out of that than any report that could ever be written. Why am I showing you this? It can be done. You can create an environment where students feel that their process of education means something. Now, I've got to give it a caveat. That took place in a face-to-face, but the same thing can happen online. It's only up to one's imagination to achieve it. We've covered many topics, from what the mission of a university is, through the role of a camera, to the nature of planning and what the facilitator brings to the table. We've looked at issues of empathy and external spillover factors. We've looked at assessment models. We've looked at the pedagogy. We've looked at the global issues, empathy, camera and planning. And we've also looked at the things that will push back against our capacity to achieve those outcomes. But as you're looking and thinking about the issues that I've raised, have a look again at the clip behind me, the creativity cycle. Those individuals that created that, and there are many more examples I can give you, will offer not only to the organizations that they will work with and lead in the future, but to themselves a sense of real achievement, a sense of purpose, as opposed to ending up with a degree that they'll hang on the wall that they might look at when they're 40 or 50 and get the dust off. What's the purpose of our conversation today? Do me a favor. I don't need likes, dings, endorsements, or whatever else happens on a YouTube model. What I'm really interested in is what you think. In the comments section, there are 2 email addresses. I want you, if you feel it's in your interests, to contact me, Dr. Leon Levin, at those addresses, and tell me whether or not what we've talked about is relevant to you. More importantly, tell me what I've missed. I want to learn from you guys. I want to see whether or not this conversation has been worthwhile. If it has been, Start a conversation among your friends. Start a conversation among your cohorts. Share this YouTube clip. Show it to other individuals. Get their point of view. Start the debate. And that way we might be able to achieve something. The bottom line is we've all got a responsibility, not just to the very people we communicate and educate with. We've all got a responsibility to ourselves. We have to be the best we can be. And I'll tell you another thing and another thought to leave you with. If you think COVID's been defeated, I've got some bad news for you. It's an incredible, insidious virus that understands Darwinist thought better than anybody. It's agile and it will adapt. I only hope that it adapts to a benign stage. But if it doesn't, and if we get iterations beyond Delta, we might find ourselves back into a situation where we've got to go to the online model. The genie's out of the bottle. Whether or not it's imposed upon us, or whether or not we cannot stop the progress in which it's coming. We can either react or we can be proactive. There's no right answer. There's your answer. And it's up to you to come up with models, innovative approaches and ideas that can embrace what has worked in the past but adapt it to a new reality. Please don't tell me it can't be done, because quite frankly it's bullshit. It can be done. The only thing that limits it is your ability to say it can't be. How do I know? I've done it. Believe me, I've done it. I hope at the end of the day this has been a useful conversation. I want to thank Alex. Alex, come here. Put your head in front of the camera. That's Alex. He's got a head for radio. He's been amazing. He's helped me put this together. And so he'll give his link down below if you ever need someone who can help you. My sons, Aaron and Gideon, have been amazing. My family's been supportive. They've pushed me to do this. But I guess at the end of the day, the benefit I'll get if someone at least initiates a conversation. As I've said, 2 emails down below. Contact me if you want. I hope you've enjoyed the discussion, and I hope you're inspired by the creativity cycle behind me. All the best, and I wish you safety in a very unsafe world at the moment. See ya.